College football nerds here talking Pac-12 championship game, Oregon and Washington. It is a repeat of an awesome game we saw earlier in this year. I want to remind y'all, please, if you haven't already, like and subscribe and check out collegefootballnerds.com. We've really built something that is stats heaven. So if you're a college football fan that loves stats, it's there for you. We're going to show you the model prediction of this game later in the show. You can go check out our model on collegefootballnerds.com and simulate any two teams against one another. It's a lot of fun. We've got NFLU stats, so you can track your favorite college football team's NFL players' statistics with one click instead of chasing box scores, and lots of other stuff to love. Josh, let's get into this game. It's going to be kind of a quick discussion. Wanted to make sure that we give this game some love, even though we were running out of time this week. And the thing that really jumped out to me that was interesting, because Washington already beat Oregon this year, yet Oregon is an 8.5-point favorite in this game. I think that some of that has to do with the fact that the second Oregon lost to Washington, the minute after, everybody was already piling on an assumed win against Washington in the rematch in the Pac-12 championship game. And I think that there's Vegas doesn't just pick on who they think is going to win or lose. They also pick where the money's going to go, and they tap into the collective psyche of not just the gambling public, but the general public on how teams are, trending. And I wonder, Josh, if a little bit of this is recency bias, it is style of play, it is how teams have performed against one having a tougher schedule than the other. To me, I wonder, Josh, I'm asking you, is a little bit of this Vegas number just tapping into that, what everybody assumes, because they're maybe overly impressed by big numbers against inferior competition?
I think it's a little column A, a little column B, right? So Washington and Oregon have played a lot of similar teams. Washington's schedule is pretty backloaded. And Oregon has some impressive wins, and they have some wins that are pretty similar to Washington. Washington beat USC by 10. Oregon beat USC by 11. By 9. I can't count. Utah, though, for example, was a blowout for Oregon. It was a close win, one-score win for Washington. Oregon State was a game that Oregon just handily won 31-7. And for Washington, that was a 22-20 game. Washington State's one of the worst teams in the Pac-12. That was a nail-biter 24-21 game. Meanwhile, Oregon is thumping Arizona State 49-13, thumping California 63-19. And so I think it's really the continued dominance, right? I think it's a little too easy to say that Oregon has just dominated everyone, because that USC game was a little bit close. I do think Utah, there's something squirrely there. They've been a very up-and-down team all year, and I think some of it is a little matchup driven in how you play. Oregon, in particular, in my mind, is a team that is well built to beat average or worse defenses. They do a lot of stuff to spread the field. They attack the field vertically. They attack the field horizontally. They have a lot of speed and skill position talent. And they run a lot of stuff, actually, with five-man protection. And they can do that a little bit because Bo Nix is a runner, so there's still some threat to run. Washington is a more traditional football team. Even though Penix is a guy that stretches the field and has a big arm, they still like to be physical. They still like to run the football. They're not quite built in the same way to just get a guy in space and make him work, right? I think, take who's the most effective player on a typical basis for Washington. That's probably Odunze, and Odunze is a big, tall, physical possession receiver. He's not a guy that you're going to throw to in the flat and expect him to juke three guys out of their shoes. And so I do think there's a combination of factors that come into play, including how that game ended in the Oregon game, right? Oregon outgained Washington by a significant margin, but went over 3 and 4th down, made the plays, didn't make the plays they needed where Washington did. And the thought is that isn't going to replicate itself. But I would turn it around a little bit and say, Daniel, that I do think here and even in our model, there's probably, in my mind, some question of whether stylistically Washington is a team that maybe is better built to play high-level competition, or at least scales better against high-level competition is the way I'd put it, and struggles from a scaling perspective against lower-level competition, where Oregon is much more of an open spread team, much more college team in that regard. And those are teams that tend to dominate weaker competition and then scale a little more poorly against better competition. So I do think you're right and where it comes from. But I also think philosophically, and if you look, a lot of you haven't maybe followed our channel. If you do and you find it interesting, please like and subscribe, follow us, keep supporting us. This is a discussion we've had about a lot of teams for many years. It's a discussion we had about Auburn and Malzahn, some ways about Florida when Urban Meyer was there, or Ohio State.
JT Barrett,
Yeah.
Ohio State teams.
Yeah, a lot of these offenses in college that can be very effective are built to create space, get a fast guy the ball in space, and let him move. I mean, Trevion Henderson is the most effective back at Ohio State, and they were on our case because we had said in previews, I actually think Trayanum may be a more effective back against somebody like Michigan. And sure enough, he had a higher per carry average. I took a lot of heat. You can go look at the comments of the preview we did on that. But it's because physicality, pro-style offenses, that kind of stuff, more NFL-type stuff, works against more the closer you get to an NFL-style defense. And when you play teams that are slower, it's not just about a talent advantage. It's about the fact that slower, less talented defenders leave more space in general. There's more cushion, and the gaps and spacing and reaction time are slower. You can run a different style of offense that's very effective that just doesn't work against better competition. So there's a lot of things I think competing here that make this a hard projection, and I think maybe explain why the prior result doesn't meet with the spread, and then maybe it doesn't.
I think there's also maybe a little bit of sequencing at play. Like Oregon State put the world into that game against Washington, and that game was in horrific weather conditions. And so that game, Oregon getting Oregon State after that game against Washington is a sequencing thing that might have played into their hands in terms of dominating them. I don't really care about the tight Apple Cup score. We saw all weekend where rivalry games came down to one score. Ohio State, Michigan, Iron Bowl, Georgia Tech was an 8-point game, I think it was. So, you can kind of throw that out a little bit. But I will say there's at some point the data does mount a little bit in that, we talked about how hard it is to play at Washington. And that I think that crowd's worth obviously more than 3 points. And that was the case in the Oregon game. And Oregon still almost won that game. But also, at some point, the close games against mediocre teams does start to not only change public perception, but give an actual indicator that there might be some issues at hand. And Washington has played 7 games this year that they won by 9 points or fewer, and some of those were against bad teams. Arizona State 15-7 is a tough look for me. Utah 7-point win. Washington State, Oregon were tight games. We've talked about those. So from that standpoint, I think there is a little bit like the ability to dominate weak opponents does matter. The problem is with schedule isolation, and conference isolation, we don't know much about the opponents of Washington and Oregon. Though we do know that if you go way back to September, an 8-point win over Texas Tech, and then Texas beats them by 50 this weekend, it's really tough to know what to make of these two teams and how they're going to match up in a rematch. We also know it's very hard to beat a team twice in the same season. So let's talk about what the model thinks about it, and then we'll get some picks.
So the model has this about an 11-point game. It has Oregon 37.5, Washington 26.7. Basically across the board, it has the Oregon the better team. 7.1 yards per play projected, which is quite high. 6 yards per play for Washington. Passing about 8.5 yards per attempt, which we usually say is the mark. 8.5 is about the mark of a good passing attack. 7.5 is competent. Washington at 7.6 is just at the competent mark. And then rushing usually hovers around 4.5 yards per carry is a good rushing attack. Oregon at 5.6 yards per carry is moving the ball quite well on the ground. Washington at 3.7 yards per carry is not. And you can almost boil down the entire perspective here on that fact that Oregon has a 36% advantage running the ball, and then Washington only has about a 3% advantage running the football. And we have these relative performance statistics, so you can go look at collegefootballnerds.com. You can run the model yourself or model any other team, including a playoff opponent, but you can also look at absolute stats and relative performance. Relative performance means against this schedule, looking at how you did against your opponents and how everyone else did, were you 20% better, like on a per carry, per attempt basis than everybody else had been versus them? Were you 20% worse? So completely opponent adjusted way of looking at rushing, passing performances, etc. Trying to take out the idea of, are you in a pass apping league? Are you in a defense dominated league? And just looking at it from that perspective. And that's where Oregon has pretty sizable margins, about a 25% advantage on average running and throwing compared to Washington. And so that's the model, higher than the spread, which I think is interesting, right? And I do think that reflects something we were talking about before, Daniel. We were talking about why is the spread so high? And I think the answer really just is overall game performance. It is the fact that if you do power metrics, there really is a significant margin between Oregon and Washington. I'll note we have a power rating, so you can look at a model-based rating. And what we do is we take our model, we take your team, and we run it against every other team in the country and say, what would your record be if you played everyone else? Now, that's probability-based, so if you have two games that are 50-50, it's going to guess you're going to go 1-1, right? If you've got a 60% chance to win 5 games, it's going to assume you're going to go 3-2 in those games. And it is right now, Oregon is the number one team in our power rating. 126 wins, 5.5 losses. They just jumped Michigan, who fell back another slot. Washington, though, is only 9th at 115 wins. Pretty big gap. What I think is interesting is they're 9th and Alabama's 11th. But Alabama would actually be favored over Washington if you model it, which talks about how matchup dependent our model is. It's not just a pure power rating model. And I think it is the matchups that also drive a little bit why the score projection is so high. And so when you look at it from that perspective, going back to the scheme issues I talked about, I think there is something here that Vegas is holding it down a little bit beyond that. Vegas does think, not that Oregon is a paper tiger, but they're a paper tiger compared to being the number one team in the country. I don't think Vegas quite sees them that way. They're more like maybe like the 5th, 6th, 7th best team in the country in overall rating. And I think there is some genuine question of whether there are scaling issues with Oregon, because when they've played better defenses, and Oregon State, look, is a better defense. They're like in the 40s, 20s. They're not a good defense, but they're average to above average, really average P5 defense. And they scored 31 points, which is just sort of a reasonably high number, not all that far off offensively in terms of metrics from how Washington did against the same team. So against a Washington team that, look, their defense isn't great, but it's still one of the better ones in the Pac-12, you start to wonder if you get this convergence of Washington scales a little better and Oregon does not, and it pushes the number close together. And so I do think that's what you end up with. Nix is a more consistent passer, I think, than Penix. Penix, though, can and does do some things that maybe Nix doesn't. And then those plays, the wow plays, matter more against better teams. The routine screen passes matter less. Those plays are less open. And it's not enough to give Oregon an advantage, but it is, or Washington an advantage by any means, but it is enough to compress it a little bit from a power rating perspective, which says this should be like a 2-touchdown spread, to Vegas saying it's a little more like a 1-touchdown game, especially in the view of the fact that Washington did already beat Oregon this year.
All right, I'm ready to give my score on this one. All of what we've said about scaling issues and pro style being more effective, I still do feel like Oregon wins this game. I think for 2 reasons. One, I think Oregon has more momentum, and momentum is a thing. It just is. I don't know how to describe it. It's a little more heavy in college basketball than it is in college football, but I think it's a thing. Oregon's got a little more momentum, and I do attribute some of their loss to being at Washington. I think a neutral field changes the dynamics a good bit because I have so much respect for playing on the road there. I think that that changes the dynamics a little bit here. Give me Oregon 31, Washington 27, and tell me what you got.
I actually like Oregon by a decent margin. I'm going to take Oregon 34-20. And so for all this discussion, and there's going to be a lot of people complaining in the comments, you guys probably didn't stick around to the end of the video because I do think these issues exist for Oregon. I do think their offense doesn't scale at a high level. But saying it doesn't scale talks about, it's maintaining its effectiveness. It doesn't deal with the fact of how good are you to start with. Oregon is a more balanced team. They are a more effective team in terms of their ability to do everything on the football field. They can throw over the middle. They can throw deep. They can throw short. They can throw screens. They can run the ball. Oregon State had fits with Oregon in large part because of how hard it is to defend every square inch of the football field, because Oregon can attack you everywhere. I have not seen that to the same extent with Washington. Yes, they do have a pretty good rushing attack, but they don't run it as successfully, or at least on a consistent basis. And Penix is more prone to need to make hero plays because partly that offense just doesn't generate as many open guys, and they've got to do things like throw to Odunze in tight coverage and hope he can make a play on the ball, whereas Oregon's throwing to open guys just as a matter of scheme. And this does get to the other thing that we haven't talked about as much, which is just flat out, when you're talking about these two teams, who's got the better defense? And right now I think it's Oregon. I mean, why did Oregon State get blown out by Oregon? It's because he ran for 2.2 yards per carry, 53 yards. Ran for almost 150 yards on Washington. It was only 3.7 yards per carry, but still a more effective day, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns. So if Oregon can render Washington a little more one-dimensional, a little more productive defensively, which I think they can do, and Oregon is able to be a little more aggressive, a little less skittish, again, maybe you don't go for it on fourth down as many times, which I think killed them in the first game against Washington, they have the potential to just move the ball better. I think they're just a better football team than Washington. So I do give them an edge, and given the revenge factor and everything on the table, I think that amplifies to Oregon winning by a decent margin. And, it's 34-20, and I think there's a good chance this game is not going to ever really feel that competitive. I think Washington's luck may just kind of run out. And those are words, if you're a Washington fan, you feel free to throw back in my face later. Hey, man, we're making predictions, and I'm trying to stick my neck out with what I genuinely think will happen. Probably be better for the show if I picked Washington and talked about just how Penix and Odunze were unstoppable, and I think they are very good. I just don't think that pairing is enough, even with a run game, to overcome it. And I just think Oregon's a better team with more weapons, more options, and divorced from the hostile reality of that Washington crowd. To your point, I think that's going to create a snowball effect where Washington's just going to struggle to stay into this game all the way through the fourth quarter.
All right, y'all, let us know what you think about our predictions in this game and how you think this game's going to go. And we'll get down in the comments and let you know how you are right or how you are wrong. Remember, please like and subscribe. And please have a great week. And God bless.